Welcome back to Imagine If. I'm your host as always, the butler. Today's story takes place in a prison, and while the prisoner is set to be put to death, some strange paranormal activity lingers around. But before we jump into the action, I would like to thank each and every one of my supporters and everyone who supports this channel in general. If you are new to the channel, welcome. Today's show of real versus fake scary stories will be a very entertaining one. As I mentioned earlier, I will be telling a story about a prisoner who is set to be put to death by electric chair. It's up to you, the viewer, to determine if this story is true or completely false. At the end of the show, I would tell you if this story was based off actual facts or if this was completely made up from my creative imagination. Are you ready to play? A man named Kevin Brady was convicted of murder in 1980. Kevin Brady has never changed his story. He has repeated over and over that he's an innocent man. Kevin was arrested on March 13th, 1980, in connection with 3 homicides, including the death of 3 teenage girls. Kevin lived alone. 10 years before this, Kevin divorced his wife, and she fled the state with his children. On the night in question, Kevin's only alibi was he was home alone. 3 girls, which were sophomores in high school, were walking home from a high school football game. According to eyewitnesses claimed to see a man in a white van pull up next to the girls and offer them a ride. After these girls refused to get into the car, a man pulled out a pistol and threatened the girls. The girls complied, and unfortunately, no one ever seen the girls alive again after that. 3 weeks later, the remains of the girls were found on the side of the Highway 38. Kevin did, in fact, have a white van that matched the description of the van in question. After doing a thorough investigation of Kevin's car and Kevin's house, a grand jury convicted Kevin, and he was put on death row. 20 years of being in prison and on death row, the day finally came for Kevin to be put to death by electric chair. When the guard came and asked Kevin for his last meal request, Kevin's declined. He declined the meal, but he asked to speak with his children one last time before being put to death. The guard allowed Kevin to make one last phone call before being executed. Kevin called his loved ones and told them that he loved them very much and he would see them on the other side. After the phone call, Kevin was escorted to the room to be put to death. Kevin sat down in the electric chair and the guards taped his eyes shut. They lowered the helmet down on his head and gagged him with a rubber ball in his mouth. They asked him, "Kevin, do you have any last words?" Kevin replied, "Please let my children know how much I love them." Kevin then gripped the chair very tightly. The warden gave the okay for the guard to pull down the switch, and that's what the guard did. The guard pulled down the switch, but nothing happened. The guard flipped the switch back up, and then he pulled it down again, one more time, but still, nothing happened. Kevin was then sent back to his room, and he was to be executed the following day. After getting an electrician in to see what was going on with the electric chair. The electric chair worked perfectly fine, according to the electrician and his colleagues. Unexplainable, it only did not work when Kevin was sitting in the chair. The next day came, and Kevin was awoke by one of the guards who said that he needed to speak with the warden immediately. Kevin was in high hopes that maybe his kids had come see him one last time, but the news he got from the warden was even better than that. When Kevin walked into his cell, There was the warden, and there was another gentleman that he had never seen before in plain clothes. His name was Bell Richardson. Bell told Kevin that he was the man who actually killed the girls almost 20 years ago. Bell confessed to killing all 3 girls. And he was here for one thing and one thing only. And that was to make things right. The warden, the guards, and the media could not believe what they had just heard. Kevin was immediately set free, and the state granted him $5 million. Kevin now is remarried, and he visits his children often. This story is very strange in itself. But how do you explain the correlation of an innocent man's life being spared by an electrical issue which has never happened before? Also, this is the only recorded time that this chair had ever defaulted. How do you explain the timing of Bell Richardson coming to confess hours after the default and hours before the execution? Thank you guys so much for tuning in to today's show. How do you think you scored? Do you think this story is true? Do you think it's false? If you thought that this story sounded familiar and you thought the story was true, I got you. This story never happened. It never took place. Thanks again for watching.